Hello, welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce Amale Andraos to lecture here at SCI-Arc tonight. I think in many ways the work of Amale, which of course by now everybody knows, she's the Dean of Columbia, but the focus of the lecture is her own work and the work through rethinking the notion of books and many other things that she will tell you, and the work that she does with her partner Dan Booth in New York. But in relation to this, I think their work, Amale's work, touch on a series of issues which I think they are absolutely crucial to some of the discussions that are floating right now in the field and the discipline in a school like ours and others, and her school and others. And I think it had to do, I think they try to operate in multiple scales. And this is not really new for architecture. I mean, architects forever have been working at the urban scale, at the building scale. And of course, today, sustainability, ecology, and many other things come to play. But I think one of the interesting shifting paradigms about this is that I think many of the contemporary techniques and technologies of production as produced in a relation in which scale is becoming a much more complex situation in the sense of how we operate. There is a kind of sense of holistic approach to things that I would argue that 20, 30, or 40 years ago that was different. There was a kind of a predetermination by scale to operate. Then today, I think we are in much more blurred territory, which allows in many ways to operate from multiple scales in an easier way, but at the same time in a more complex way. This is, I think, is a very intricate part of what they do. I think the other one, which I think Amale and I will discuss in other occasion, is with the rightfully so raising into interest in how the social issues come to play, how we have to fight in which the architecture design agenda doesn't get washed or that disappear. So I think their work take on that challenge, and we'll see tonight and how that start to operate and shape what other possibilities can introduce for the conversation. And ultimately, to me, it's always a pleasure, and I think it's always important that with people that lecture in the traditional SCI-Arc, we have to do with people who have a practice, people who teach, and in this case, somebody who leads an extraordinary school. I always curious to see how each of these individuals try to navigate these different territories and what fits what and where the limit starts and where it ends, and how much the profession and the discipline and the speculative thinking and the practical thinking negotiate those territories. So I think having a Amale lecture here is very proper in the particular time and context that we are today and now. So I'm really curious to see what is her point of view and contribution in some of these subjects. So please join me to welcome Amale Andraos to SCI-Arc.
Thank you, Hernan. It's really a great pleasure to be here tonight. I feel like SCI-Arc is, of course, a sort of sister institution to Columbia GSAP, and it's in the last 2 years, we certainly have been kind of getting vibes, and they're really great vibes, and it does feel like it's a moment where things are starting sort of fresh again, but also building in relation to kind of legacies. So as Hernan said, tonight I'm going to focus on my practice, WORKac, with my partner Dan Wood, but I'm hoping that the lecture won't be too long so that we can have questions and a conversation afterward. The title of the lecture is the Duograph as opposed to the monograph. Because it's Dan and I, and a desire not to complicate the notion of authorship, let's say. And I just had a really interesting conversation with Todd Gannon, watched the SCI-Arc channel, about books and architecture. So I'll just touch a little bit on that, and then very candidly sort of take you through some of the thinking we've been doing as we are trying to build this Duograph. So it's a kind of very imperfect thinking, but in many ways speaks to, I think, what Hernan was saying, the multiple ingredients and scales that today practices are not so much synthesizing, but rather bringing together to try to find where we can operate as architects and as designers. The monograph as project, of course, Bernard Tschumi with his many publications, including Event Cities and the Manhattan Transcripts. In these books, the notion of kind of research and design kind of come together and become one. The declaration of scale as the main kind of project, density, this is MVRDV's Pharmax, form, these kind of singular manifesto-like sort of positions. Whereas I would say that I feel like I belong to a generation where that kind of singular declaration has become more complicated, and while certainly we were all starting with the desire to just engage practice, I think now the books are starting to kind of loop back to writing, but not so much in this kind of declaration of a project, but rather declaration of the possibility of body of work. This is LTL's intensities. These are sort of just some of the most recent, but there are many more, and many are coming. Moss selected works where, you know, the manifesto is really a kind of description of the office and the practice, in fact, very kind of deadpan. Johnson Markley, a house is a house is a house is a house. So the artifact in terms of creating associations between art and architecture and between different kinds of work sort of reveals itself without a sort of manifesto declaration. Office, of course, or Scape, which Kate Orff, which is slightly more sort of directed in terms of a project, but nevertheless very much coming out of practice. And this is just one spread of a beginning of our Duograph, which, thinking about these kind of multiple themes, we're sort of very simply, this is really a working kind of sort of structure where we've decided to look at this question of scale, as Hernan had mentioned, and in our case, scale is not necessarily something that we sort of declared a priori, but rather something that happened where the kind of first 5 years, we like to think in terms of 5-year plans also, so when you launch your practice, 5-year plans can be a kind of very Sovietic way to organize yourself. But the first 5 years was really about kind of interiors and a sort of say yes to everything, try to kind of engage as many conditions and projects as possible. The second 5 years were really the scale of urbanism. So in each case, we kind of went from the small scale of the inside to the large scale of kind of the urban. And then I would say that we're in a phase right now where we're trying to bring the two together, again at the scale of the building, with a particular emphasis on sort of that boundary, which is architecture, between inside and outside. So almost 15 years to discover where architecture might sit for us. So I'm going to take you through these themes and not to describe so much the actual projects, but to kind of theme that cuts across that kind of particular sort of section, let's say. So when we first started the practice, we went from very large scale to the doghouse as our first project, which gave the tone a little bit to the practice as one that would engage not just with humans, but with other species, and always think about larger ideas, even within the small scale of a doghouse. So this is a doghouse with the dog on a treadmill, kind of chasing butterflies. It's an urban dog, so it's a kind of escape machine for the urban dog. Of course, very interested in still in kind of event and program for my kind of genealogy and how to sort of transform existing buildings, let's say, into something completely different. So the entrance in program kind of undermines itself, in fact. This was a drawing we did for the Guggenheim called the Flow Show, proposing a sort of different experience to visit exhibitions swimming rather than walking. An interest in the urban, but not so much, in fact, the kind of metropolis of a kind of Rem Koolhaas, but rather sort of more either unfinished or undone urban conditions. This is a theoretical master plan for downtown Beirut as a kind of alternate to what was built. So very speculative work, an interest in sections, in kind of carving voids, graphics and super graphics, looking at sort of not making any difference between, let's say, what could be wallpaper or decoration and what could constitute space and architecture, which carried to some of the interiors we originally designed. And the idea was, if you let us go, we'll just paint it all different colors and maximize the kind of thinness of the surface and intensify it through graphics. Color, kids, looking at scale, even at the kind of scale of a child, to try to modulate space and experiences in different ways. An obsession with balloons and in all ways, and a kind of interest in sort of dumb shapes, let's say, rather than sort of highly complex geometries. And so some of these ideas we are kind of putting together in this first chapter called Inner Life, looking at how some of the very kind of large ideas about difference, about kind of scale, about aggregation, can make their way into even the kind of space of an interior. This is one of our first projects, a 6,000 square foot kind of loft in New York, where the idea was to just sandwich, rather than create a very open architectural space, sandwich many, many experiences in many rooms. So the enfilade, where the enfilade kind of changed from the horizontal plane on the ground floor and then became vertical with a kind of inverted 3 stories at the other end of the apartment. And always a question and an interest in sort of childlike representation, if you like, where materials and colors are always embedded within the kind of architectural idea, and where section and compression happen even at the scale of a single room. And so this is the kind of apartment with these series of rooms that transform through tables that go up and down to connect all of the rooms into a single experience for large dinners or catwalks, etc. And these kind of sliver of moments where we, using material and minimum kind of shaping, sort of create difference and interruptions and a sort of heterogeneity in the experience. As we go down, a doghouse. So our speculative work seems to always make itself back into our real work. This was the dumbwaiter for Stitch. The dog, Stitch, hated to go up and down. Stitch is dead, but the dumbwaiter is still there. And so because Stitch hated the stairs, 3-story stairs, we built a dumbwaiter doghouse for him. And then always a kind of interest in materials, finding ways to bring light into the depth of the apartment and carving, creating kind of courtyards, and again engaging with play as well as with drinking. This is like the tequila nook where the parties end. The second sort of theme, the context that we operate in today, but also as a result of sort of our own interest, that context wasn't necessarily, again, the metropolis, but rather contexts such as these. This is Orange County, where our first sort of ground-up building was built, and the contrast between this kind of desert sort of field, which used to have orange trees, and then the kind of suburban development right next to it. And so in this context, we built the first building, a store for anthropology, with a kind of crenellated facade to try to create indoor-outdoor moments and a sliver of non-shopping zones, and then using a kind of green screen at the top to try to engage with, transform the kind of architecture and bring a kind of natural element to it. In the middle of the store, we carved a courtyard, again with an orange tree, in kind of memory of the orange trees that used to be there, and always display between the kind of natural and the artificial through framing of either real quote-unquote nature, such as the tree, or artificial, such as this kind of shopping topography. So here you see the facade, kind of crenellated, sometimes shopping, sometimes seating, sometimes completely open to the outdoor. And at night, the kind of green screen weighing above, which recently we shot again, has kind of grown. Although this context is in California, is not so different from this other context, which I think was quite important for many architects of our generation, which is Ordos 100 in Inner Mongolia, a project where Ai Weiwei and Herzog and de Meuron invited 100 architects to design a 10,000 square villa. So this is 100 architects dressed in black looking for their site at all cost. And again, a very similar context to Orange County, where these kind of endless speculative developments were being built to house a population that was supposed to come, but nobody knew from where. So here we are, architects, each with our little plot, very excited to plop our little villa. And so kind of very different, very sort of, I think, problematic moment for us, at least for Dan and I, thinking, you know, is that all? We should be excited to have a little plot to build a house. So our house was a very walled house, sort of kind of turning inwards and shutting down from the context, opening up just slightly to the outside, and in the sort of onion diagram, layering from outside to inside a series of walls. So with the one main room at the ground floor, but then a sort of a field of rooms at the top, a kind of hutong-like, very compressed, so that the villa could house either a single family or 4 or more families. So it's kind of undermining the excess of the 10,000 square foot scale. So here you see the kind of layering of the onion and then the kind of field of rooms up top. And so the main view really became a view to the sky, perforating the villa. This really kind of led us to think, well, maybe architecture is not where it's at right now, and we should suspend building for a moment. And we wrote 49 cities, a kind of research into 49 visionary cities, looking just at the shape of the cities, the forms, and also how they measured in terms of ecological performance. So flattening everything else, but really kind of performance on one side and the kind of footprint or the sort of form on the other. That really became the project of the office, looking at architecture really at the intersection of, let's say, the urban and the natural and the rural. And so thinking about architecture as infrastructure, or infrastructure as a way to connect the architectural and the urban, we became interested in the question of food as a system really connecting and working through scales. and started to sort of at times delete the architecture, only to highlight the kind of possibility of growing food everywhere in between. So these are a series of projects that are really about infrastructure, in this case stacking different housing and expanding the core to host a number of systems, or creating a sort of diagonal housing with terraced farming on top. Sorry. Or a sort of fish farm urban sculpture. All of that thinking, and in particular 49 cities, led to Public Farm 1. The first time we sort of projected, let's say, our own agenda onto a project where the architecture, which was a very simple aggregate of cardboard tubes going from 0 to 30 feet in the air, and holding an organic farm at the top, and a series of interactive moments at the bottom, where the structure became a kind of organizer of both microenvironments and program. So this is the kind of aggregation of the cardboard tube, the farm, and then these intimate moments underneath that one could experience through a periscope. So this was, I would say, the first 5 years. And the next 5 years were really kind of started at the end of Public Farm 1, where sort of a kind of interest in, where the kind of sensibility started to emerge, a kind of very pop sensibility. And one that, at the time, really resisted anything that was excessively technological. So our answer to, let's say, fabrication was this: a clay model, a Play-Doh model for a kind of urban projects, a competition for, this was meant to be Hudson Yards. I think it's better than the Hudson Yards that's getting built now by KPF, by the way. Architecture made out of sand dune, or again, always the kind of embrace of color as a very simple way to create difference and experience and space. So this was for our Children's Museum of the Arts, where we couldn't pick one color, so we did a color wheel, because clients really get scared of color. And Public Farm 1, which is, it's very rare that an installation lead directly to a project, but in our case it did. A partner of Alice Waters came to us and said, we want to build the first edible schoolyard here in Brooklyn. Sorry. And so we took over half an acre and turned it into an organic farm near a public school, and built this structure, a sort of a combination of greenhouse, kitchen, classroom, and what we call the systems wall, where all of the systems connecting the structure to the garden, the composting, the chicken coop, the tool shed, the water collecting, would happen in these series of shapes. So this is the building and the garden, and here the systems wall, expressing very playfully, but also in some ways pedagogically, how the building systems connect to the garden. The kitchen classroom, bringing the gradient to the inside. And then the greenhouse, where the kind of pattern of the facade becomes one of the main walls, and where during the winter kids host, study and connect food to what they're learning in science or in history in the kind of brick-walled kitchen classroom. And so what was interesting for us was to create a building that was very much about difference and about a kind of stacking horizontally, similar to the loft I showed earlier, and also echoing some of our kind of favorite projects, this kind of very dumb sandwiching, layering. This is the site best showroom where the kind of trees just kind of grow out of the building, and there's a kind of layering horizontally. We also wanted to explore the pattern on the facade and try to connect that surface with the garden, but using super graphics. and listed our favorite flower pattern, which is an interesting story of a wallpaper scaled, a very personal wallpaper scaled up to become the entire facade of this highway. And so interpreted that pattern and using residential shingles, very off-the-shelf shingles, but changing the overlap in the shingle created a pixelated pattern of interpreting and distorting the Venturi Scott Brown one. So this is now the second version of the Edible Schoolyard we're doing at PS7 in Harlem with planters and an elevated greenhouse and a classroom. So Urbanisms, scaling up completely to look at what we were kind of looking for in 49 cities, kind of bringing urbanism and ecology together, and working on a number of master plans. This one for seven campus university in Weifang in China, moving very, very fast. And the ability to work on these master plan really came out of another speculative project. This was Nature City, which we designed for MoMA's exhibition for clothes, Rehousing the American Dream, where we wanted to try to reinvent Ebenezer Howard's town country for the 21st century. Can we really take seriously these conditions that I showed earlier of the kind of suburban, undifferentiated mat of new urbanist housing, and instead create both density and openness? So more density and more openness with these kind of taking the essence of the urban as the kind of pier of 2 streets and a few blocks, and then enough space in between to have wildlife exist and cross. So this was a section of Nature City built for the exhibition, where really each housing block also acts as infrastructure, a kind of ecological infrastructure, whether cleaning the water, so your backyard is really looking at a pond that's sort of filtering the gray water. Here you see the kind of crenellated flower housing, or thinking about the core of a tower and using that to celebrate water system and pressure. Here a kind of high-rise of home version, or the compost mound, where a kind of housing structure above a large composting sort of space. So you get the idea. So really kind of thickening the problem of housing. And then taking the most generic housing, the little house, and by simply kind of compressing it and sandwiching it and putting the lawn at the top, we would be able to create hyper density and yet preserve some of what people love about the suburbs. So these very sort of large-scale ideas made their way back into architecture, or at least the scale of the building, but again, trying to find ways to integrate the built and the green, let's say, but always making holes, perforating, to kind of blur the two without creating landforms or without sort of losing the kind of built. Perforating, and being more interested in some ways in what was around the building rather than the building itself. And so that thinking sort of gelled in a kind of way from PF1 through Edible Schoolyard to Gabon, a conference center in Libreville, Gabon, a competition, international competition that we won already a few years ago. And what was interesting about the competition is that, of course, as many competitions in parts of in the developing world, it was about to announce the kind of emergence of a new country onto the global scene, let's say, as a global player. And in the case of Gabon, announcing the transition from an oil economy to a green, sort of more service economy. Gabon has incredible sort of variety of ecosystems and landscape, but also an incredibly dense capital where most of the people live. So a lot of the nature, let's say, is preserved. And an incredible history as well of tropical modernism, very, very bold architecture, as well as a very interesting urban sort of history. This is Dolivo, an architect that we sort of discovered while working on the project. He was a good friend of Soleri, had collaborated with him, and was really interested in urbanism and ecology. This was in the 70s, and worked in places such as Baghdad and various parts of Africa, as many Italian architects did after in the kind of post-colonialist era. So this became the proposal, a sort of building completely perforated by different courtyards and different landscapes, and where the main facade is the roof. As you come up from the city, the site is a diplomatic park, and the roof is where all of the water is kind of collected as a way to connect the architecture to the landscape around. The water is filtered through the various ponds in the landscape, and the sense of connection continues to the facade, which is quite transparent with these series of louvers. And in between the two facades, two skins, are either these sort of big holes, these kind of suspended courtyards that you saw in plan, or this continuous promenade, this kind of informal indoor-outdoor circulation space, meeting space, where things sort of happen informally in terms of conversation, etc., and where you either have a view out onto the park or in onto the courtyards. And so these two skins really became the main kind of concept for the building. And the two skins kind of come together at the moment of these courtyards. With each courtyard a kind of different landscape. So this is a sort of agricultural growing courtyard. We had the kind of waterfall courtyard, which, as in Nature City, is a moment where the water that gets kind of recycled is presented and becomes literally a waterfall. This was half a scale mock-up we did in Vermont. And the plan of the building became really this kind of the main conference room in the middle, a series of core around, and then a very open lobby carved by these courtyards, which really are sort of very heavily perceived inside the space, in contrast to the more open lobby. So the sense of the outside is pushing in or cutting is quite strong, whether it's through the kind of articulation of the ceiling where the water is being collected, or through the connection between courtyard and venue or small conference room. So, for example, in the Orchard auditorium, there's a sense of the orchard above, the sort of greenhouse venue kind of plays with light filtering to create this kind of greenhouse green atmosphere. This is in the most technologically advanced auditorium with a window onto a stone courtyard. And here, the only venue where there is no connection to the outside, the geometry of the facade and the geometry of the room created this Turrell-like fake opening. And finally, at the top, a view onto the water collecting area for the restaurant and the bar. The problem with projects that are about the end of oil is that oil doesn't seem to end. So with the price of oil kind of crashing, this is where it's at. So we'll see what happens. Let's say some of these ideas of meeting and finding formal and informal ways to sort of come together filtrated to our thinking about collaborative spaces and work in particular. And in particular through this project that we did for the ad agency Wieden+Kennedy in New York. So this is Reade Street, 3 stories of offices where we were interested in doing a kind of anti-Google scenario where if Google is suburban and all about horizontality and sprawl, we wanted to explore some of the urban ideas at the scale of an interior and explore really density, whereby sort of changing the size of furniture or the distance between a desk and a column, we could go from the 6% shared collective space that they had originally to a 25% shared space for collaborations, for meetings, etc. And really focus the project not so much on the generic kind of desk space and office space, but as with this room, focus on the various ways people meet and how long it takes. So from the very short meeting that you would have in a kind of phone booth scale room to bigger and bigger sized rooms, some of them very private, some of them more public. So this is the over-the-counter where people can come for 10 minutes, lay down the decks and have stand-up meetings. The lounges, which are sort of suspended in space to provide both privacy but also a sense of being public and connected, different sized meeting rooms, homage to the Whitney conference room, the Whitney no longer, working everywhere and a kind of ubiquitous use of technology even in cafeterias. And then scaling up to the kind of bigger architectural moments, a sort of Chumi diagram of event, let's say, where to try to find the ways to carve the largest possible opening and connect the various floors without creating a sort of singular moment or an auditorium. We took the circle, which is the biggest sized opening you can do without removing a column, and only removed one column here with an insane structure because the landlord wanted the building to be able to continue to house printing as in the 19th century if it ever came back. So this is the overscaled structure. And so these big moments, a very large scaled stair when you come in, kind of almost a sort of urban moment in the interior, which then as you go around takes your eye up all the way across the 3 floors. This stair is used for meeting and assembly, as in this room, or just a few feet this way here. It's an ad agency, so the bar, where they spend a lot of time, and then going up the second hall and always connecting the 3 spaces, sort of 3 floors visually, the library, which has a secret door to the gym. As I said, it is an ad agency. And then, but the gym doubles as a kind of black box theater. And then trying to bring the outside in, we sort of moved very simply, the kind of storefront on the edge of the building, one bay in, to create this double-height courtyard where they can work and do yoga or meet, etc. And sort of creating this hole in the building, which gives, in fact, the office a sort of presence, a sort of elevated storefront presence on the street. So we've been working a little bit with this idea. This is a competition we lost for the women's building, but again, kind of carving the building to create this series of vertical meeting spaces, outdoor spaces, etc., etc. So preservation, I think, again, preservation is something that a lot of us do, certainly in New York, but it's something that we're quite interested in, as well as it relates to the most sustainable thing you can do is actually to preserve a building. And so how to reinvent what preservation is and to be more radical with how to intervene within existing structures. So the first project, of course, was Diane von Furstenberg, where we kept the facade and built a completely new building on the inside with a very visible penthouse that connected the interior, the kind of life of the building inside to the outside. New Holland Island, a competition we won in St. Petersburg, turning this military island into a public park and then carving the existing buildings to create public space and a continuous promenade. Or in a project we did for an expansion or transformation of the Blaffer Museum in Houston, using the intervention to really connect the parking lot to the courtyard on the other side and to the campus, and bringing all of the circulation to the facade. This was a $1 million project where we sort of reorganized everything to create a sense of identity for the museum, but also a sense of transparency, cutting through from one side to the other of the campus as a sort of gate building. And so more recently, we just completed actually our first developer project in New York. I can't tell you if it was a great experience or not, but it was a very interesting experience. It's a very, very beautiful little sliver of building, landmarked, and the developer wanted not only to transform the floors into condominium, this is what developers do, but also add a penthouse. And one of the issues with the site was that the building at the corner is quite low, and so you really had views possible onto the penthouse. And so we took that constraint and traced the sort of shadow line of the views and registered the bulkhead of the adjacent building as well as the elevator bulkhead and our own bulkhead to create this kind of crenellated roof, which became sort of simplified to be kind of pushed back for zoning and kind of topped off. And become actually a very architectural and articulated penthouse, but completely invisible from the street. So this is the section of the building, and part of the idea of this kind of diagonal topography on the penthouse made its way through in a very simple way in the kind of simplex, where we were interested in taking all of the core functions and creating a sort of stepping-like topography where the kitchen could reach into a little herb garden there at the top, but where the idea was, in a kind of Japanese way, you could play with these questions of scale and compression and have a sleeping loft, or in this case, the possibility of a fern garden that is actually being watered, let's say humidified by the humidity of the shower. So all these ideas of systems making their way into a kind of architectural gesture, but into the kind of smallest space of living. So here you see the idea. So this is the simplex. with the little tiny greenhouse and the stepping. And then always playing between the kind of natural and graphics interpretation of the natural for the bathrooms here, the kind of trees, tiles. And so this is the building where the penthouse is completely invisible from the street, but highly articulated from above. And with a little terrace in front of it, and a sort of on the inside, it's a kind of 3-story penthouse where the lower floor is slightly sunken in to minimize the height. And here you see always the kind of crenulated sort of ceiling with these funny lights that become more house-like in the front with the little terrace. One of the issues with the building was that the facade, and this is the hot tub instead of the elevator. So it's quite nice. All of the capitals on the facade were gone. And, landmarks didn't necessarily want us to put them back, but we thought this was an opportunity to do something on the facade of interest to the street. And so we invited Michael Hansmeier, architect and artist, to sort of script a contemporary, what would a contemporary Corinthian column look like? And so he mapped out a number of designs and came up with many iterations, but we settled on this one. And so we put back these new Corinthian columns, which really look as if they've been there forever, but actually are completely new and contemporary, made of GFRC. So, as I said in the introduction, it's been interesting to sort of go from very small on the inside to very large at the urban scale, and then now rethink the space in between, the boundary, which is architecture, and the envelope, and the problem of the envelope, which, of course, people such as Alejandro Zerapolo have been talking about as the kind of last space for architects. But for us, it's not so much the envelope in terms of technology and performance, but again, the envelope as a space that can be inhabited even within the kind of thinnest way. Such as in this project, which is mostly storage, but where storage for a museum, but where we but the museum wanted to have a very open facade, and so we kind of carved this thickness to create a vertical public promenade. And this sort of curiosity about the envelope really started in Miami, where we are currently designing a storefront for a parking garage. This is not ours, this is Arquitectonica. But in the legacy of Arquitectonica, or the recent, this is Iwamoto Scott, and I think John Baldessari, Miami and the design district is looking at ways to sort of activate, let's say, parking lots. But again, we weren't so interested in just a kind of articulation of the surface, but rather, this is our site, finding a way to do more and to really create more of a kind of inhabited experience. And so we were given 4 feet, and we thought, well, what can happen in 4 feet? And started to explore, and wanting to really create a sort of public promenade, so taking a little bit the Gabon idea, but moving it completely vertically within the kind of 4 feet thickness, and create a sort of human ant farm of art, library, kids area, graffiti zone, water collection, etc., which in the back, behind the facade, connects to the floor plates of the parking lot in a very hot pink think this is old Miami. This is Miami Vice Pink, but it shows our age. And what's interesting about the project is it's called the Collage Garage because a series of architects are coming together. But rather than just have a kind of vertical seam in between us, we've decided to hug Jürgen Meyer because he's also designing something that has fingers, and so we designed the corner together. So that's him over there in the slightly more 70s shaped amoebas. Here you see the kissing corner. And I don't know what it's going to look like. Apparently, it might look something like this, which is the rendering that the client did. So we might disown this project, or it might be totally super cool as it turns around the corner. It was a very similar concern for the envelope that came out of the project we did for the Chicago Architecture Biennale, collaboration with Ant Farm, actual practice Ant Farm, where we actually wanted to take these notions of house, building, city, redrawing their seminal house. This is our version of the house of the century, the Dolphin Embassy, floating building, negotiating the relationship between humans and dolphins, and Convention City, their kind of proposal for a visionary speculative city. And here you see the thickness of the housing above this kind of crazy landscape. And this is a project that we had looked at for 49 cities and proposed a 3C city, convention, cruise, climate, a sort of 21st century version of Convention City, a cruise ship with a very wild landscape and living kind of thickened at the perimeter and a big kind of void in between. Obviously, this was also about the pleasure of just drawing and thinking about ways to reinterpret that history of inflatables and kind of collective living. So finally, almost in reverse order to what typical, I think the history of American practice is that you start with the house and you build up, but we seem to have shrunken to the house now. So this is the last chapter, which is greenhouse. We're currently kind of redesigning, intervening within a barn, designing a distillery / gallery space / market, and for ourselves. This is not our design, but trying to reinterpret. Obviously, we have a fascination with the desert and that history of Soleri and Arcosanti. So we're trying to reinterpret the Earth ship, but with all its ideas, but change it completely architecturally, and listing things such as Adobe brick technology, etc., but to design something that's much more radical. So this is the site. It's in Tubac, Arizona, sort of half an hour south of Tucson, where there's an existing house, and we're designing this little guest house, a combination of a very solid part and a very transparent part, which is greenhouse-like. So again, working with thickness and mass, but also lightness and transparency. This is the ground plan where the cars can park, and the whole house is lifted above. So the kind of coolings and natural cooling system happens, and heating happens through that lifting. Here, the kind of sleeping area, very in this kind of adobe-like, very thickened wall, and a very open area for living with growing plants as in a real greenhouse. And here you see the section. So it's a kind of earth ship lifted out of the earth. with, again, a fascination with all of the systems, such as in the Edible Schoolyard, the water, the heating, the cooling, et cetera, to become quite sort of architectural, a sort of little manifesto building, a little Ungers on one side, a little greenhouse on the other, and collapsing all these elements together. So we're about to start a Kickstarter campaign, so if you want to contribute. And then I'll just show very quickly 3 slides of a competition we just finished, where the envelope now is wrapping around the entire building. This is a competition entry we just completed for a museum in Beirut. That's it. Thank you.